what is beeswax? How do the bees make it? What exactly is it? What purpose does it serve? Well, it does a lot of things for the bees. Worker bees are the only bees in the hive that make beeswax. So there's 3 types of bees in a hive. There's worker bees, which are the bees that build wax, take care of the young, forage for pollen and nectar, and make honey. They do all of the work in the hive, include making beeswax. There are drones that are male bees, and their purpose, and their only purpose, is to mate with the queen. And there is a queen bee whose role is to lay the eggs and repopulate the hive. So all of those 3 bees exist in a hive, but the only ones that make wax are the worker bees. And what's interesting is they only make wax from the age of 10 days old to about 18 days old. So bees in a hive will generally, give or take, live about 40 days depending on the time of year. And just within that 10 to 18 day range are they making beeswax. When they're younger, their bodies are less developed and they may not have the wax glands developed at that point to make beeswax. And when they're older, their job generally is more foraging and getting pollen and getting nectar and bringing it back to the hive. So there's a window of time where they make beeswax. And it takes a lot of food to make beeswax. It takes about 8 pounds of consuming of honey for them to make just 1 pound of wax. So they need a lot of energy, a lot of sugar intake to then have their wax glands, which are underneath their abdomen, to produce just 1 pound of wax. So it's a pretty beautiful commodity and hard to come by when you think about it. So they use it very wisely. And it's an incredibly strong material. And I'll pass this around. This is some beeswax, and you can feel that at room temperature it's very, very hard. And they structure it into hexagonal cells, which is a very strong shape, but also very good shape for using their space wisely. And in that shape, they can store a lot of pounds of honey. So a frame that has, say, 1 pound of wax on it can hold and keep in place up to 20 pounds of honey. And you're welcome to open that bag up and touch the wax if you'd like. So again, 1 pound of wax can be transformed into the hexagonal shape to store 20 pounds of honey. So it's a very strong substance. And I'm looking at the recipe here, and the wax is melting, and we've got a few more minutes to go before it'll be totally melted, but it's coming along. Beeswax is, with all of that being said, is a pretty valuable commodity, especially in years where they're not able to make as much of it. So the way that you can view that in an economic framework is that in order for bees to make a lot of wax, they need a lot of population that are 10 to 18 days old in that time of year where there's a ton of nectar source. So the more 10 to 18 day old bees you have at the time with a high nectar source, the more wax can be made. Years like this last year where it got warm really quick in the year, before their populations were at their peak, disabled them from being able to make the amount of wax and honey that they made even, say, just last year. So that formula needs to be pretty perfect for them to make a lot of beeswax. So its value goes up when the availability of it and the amount that they can make decreases. So how do you harvest beeswax? Are any of you currently beekeepers? Okay, a few of you, awesome. So how do you harvest wax out of a hive if you are a beekeeper? How do you get that wax so that you can use it for craft recipes? There's a lot of different ways that you can do this. So I want to show a few pictures of that. This picture here that you're looking at is a picture of a couple of the bee team students up on the rooftop at Boise State. And the pictures following are of that same group of students. So burr comb. Burr comb is a cumulative term that refers to the honeycomb, the beeswax, that the bees place in all sorts of nooks and crannies of your hive that you don't necessarily want it. So they are notorious for sealing things up. So if the frames in your hive are not, don't have the correct amount of space between them, they'll fill it with beeswax and a sticky substance called propolis that can make it very difficult for you to access those frames and work with your hive. So it's beneficial in a couple of ways to harvest this burr comb. It helps to keep your hive clean. So in this photo, you'll see that they've built a lot of extra comb on the inside of the inner cover. So when we tried to pull that cover off, it had a little bit of tension to it until we could kind of pull that burr comb apart. And then in this next photo, you'll see one of the students using his hive tool to scrape that wax up so that we can harvest it. So what the student did with it after that is we keep just a small little bucket, probably no bigger than my coconut oil container here, that we just keep with us up on the rooftop so that when we find burr comb and other beeswax that we want to harvest, we scrape it off and put it in that container, and then when we have it full, we'll melt it down and filter it. So that's one way that you can harvest beeswax, is by scraping the burr comb out of your hives. And they'll build it everywhere, inside of the inner covers, between frames, on the bottoms of the frames, you name it. So if you have equipment that's not pieced together real nice, then they'll fill it. Another way that you can harvest beeswax is by scraping drone brood. And this is kind of a topic for a whole nother lecture if we wanted it to be. But one of the ways that beekeepers manage the level of mites in their hive is by scraping drone brood, where a lot of mites live. But with scraping the drone brood, you're also scraping a lot of beeswax that they've built to make the hexagonal cells to put the drones. So you can throw all of that drone brood in a solar wax melter, which we'll talk about in a second, and you can render all of that down to gather just the beeswax. So that's one way. It's kind of a gross way to harvest beeswax. As you can see this picture, it's kind of a grody looking picture with all of the dead larvae from scraping the drone brood, but it's a great way to reduce the level of mites in your hive, and it's a great way to harvest beeswax. So that's an option. Another way is to save the honey frame cappings. These are cappings that when you harvest honey, you scrape that top layer of wax from the surface of the frames. And we did that last week in the honey harvest class, but if you save all of those beautiful wax cappings, you can melt it down, separating it from the honey that's still stuck to it, and it's beautiful, white, clean, new beeswax. This is the best kind of beeswax because it's so clean. It hasn't had casings from larvae being laid in it. It hasn't been stepped on by the bees a lot, so it's a really light color, clean wax. So saving that and putting it into a colander, like you can see on the right-hand side of that picture, will allow the honey that's stuck to it to slowly drip off, and then it's pretty clean from there, and you can melt it and filter it and use it. So this is another way for you as a beekeeper to gather wax from your hive. For those of you that aren't beekeepers and want to purchase wax, there's a lot of options for that. One of the best options might be to buy it from a local beekeeper. There's a lot of beekeepers in the area. Some sell beeswax, some don't, so you could certainly ask them. But that's a great way to purchase local beeswax, which kind of makes the crafts that you're making a lot more fun, to say that was from local beehives. So you can buy directly from beekeepers, and you can also buy from local stores like the ones we were talking about. What was the one you mentioned here in Caldwell? Ron's. Do they sell beeswax?
I don't believe they do.
Oh, they do? Okay, so that's an option as well. You can buy from a local health food store. I know Natural Grocers in Boise also has it. You can buy beeswax from a variety of just health food stores. Some just general grocery stores will sell it. Another great place that you can buy larger amounts of beeswax would be through a beekeeping supplier like Man Lake or Western Bee Supply. Those are all options for online. So if you're looking for bulk beeswax, that might be the place to go. So there are options to buy beeswax locally. So you've harvested some beeswax, but then what do you do with it? How do you melt it down after you've harvested? Because there's still some gunk in it. If you've harvested it directly from the hive, you'll notice that there's still some, maybe there's some bee legs or dead bees or wings or whatnot that are stuck to it. You don't want that in your hand cream per se. So how do you melt all of that stuff down? Especially, yeah, it might add a nice little bite to it. It might be fun. How do you melt that down so that you can separate it from the rest? So we'll talk about that in just a second, but I've noticed that my mixture here is perfectly melted. And if you look back at the recipe, you'll notice that it says to heat it just to the point that it's melted. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this off. And what we're going to do is take this off the heat and let it start to cool off so that we can add in our next ingredients. So Move some of this stuff out of the way. So you can see here that it's perfectly melted. All right, it's nice and even and golden and liquid. There's no wax chunks that are still solid in it. So what I'm going to do is we'll continue on with the presentation, but we'll let this cool off just a little bit before we add in the vitamin E oil and the essential oils. And then it'll continue to cool off even more, and it'll start to congeal and form a solid substance that is ready to use.